All forecasts or estimates of demand and market potential are wrong. A forecast will never be 100% precisely accurate in any kind of meaningful real-world application. Knowing that, though, we do need to be able to understand when our forecast is likely to be more accurate or less accurate. I'm in the 0110 begin file. Now we're looking at the 01_10 caveat sheet. And what we see here is an actual real-world set of unit sales along with revenues over a 12-month period for a particular hypothetical product. Now we forecasted based on this same data that for a particular month, say June, we might have sales of 29 units. Well, if we look at the real world figure of 69 versus the unit sales forecast of 29, you might say, well, what's going on here? These seem pretty far apart. And you're absolutely right. There's a few reasons for that, and you want to be aware of this. Number one, regressions are great in some contexts. The more data we have, the more accurate your regression will be in general. We only had 176 data points here that we could use based on 178 rows of data. So our R squared, that is the amount of accuracy we can capture in our regression, is pretty limited. We're only going to capture about 15% of the variation in our unit sales data. And that's further reflected when we look at what's called the 95% confidence interval down here below. The 95% confidence interval tells us essentially the 95% likelihood for an upper or lower bound for any of these variables. So we see the intercept might be as high as 91.52 or as low as 44.04. We're essentially 95% sure it's somewhere between those two. Well, if I go through and just pick a different number within this range, let's say the upper bound estimate, 91.52, look what happens to my unit sales forecast. Now it goes up to 52. So the point is that anytime you're using regressions, we need to be careful about the variables that we're using. This is not to say regressions are a poor forecasting estimator. They're not. Regressions are very useful in my opinion. They allow us to take into account a variety of different variables. But we do need to understand the caveats on them and understand the importance of evaluating if the regression is going to be a good fit or not for our needs, how accurate it's going to be in the forecast based on the R squared and based on the relative range of these 95% confidence intervals we see. Our unit sales forecast was not crazy, wasn't unreasonable, but it wasn't especially accurate either. Now you're ready to decide how much confidence to place in any given demand estimate when you're using regressions as a tool. Product pricing isn't something most ordinary people think much about, but pricing strategy is a huge factor in the success or failure of a product. Think about how different services like Uber, Costco, or Google would be if they didn't have their unique pricing models. Now, one key element for maximizing the efficacy of a business's price is what's called price differentiation, or sometimes price discrimination. Price differentiation occurs when a business charges a different price to different groups of consumers for exactly the same good or service, but for reasons not associated with cost. In order for price differentiation to take place, you've got to have a firm that has some market power and can distinguish between their consumers and can prevent resale. Without market power, let's pretend we have two gas stations as an example. They're competing against one another. They don't have any market power. Without that market power, if gas station A raises their price per gallon on gas by 5 cents, everybody will go across the street to gas station B. There's no difference in gasoline, at least for me. I don't really care whether I have Exxon or Chevron fuel in the tank, as long as it gets me where I need to go. Similarly, in order for a firm to be able to differentiate between price, they have to understand who their different consumers are and understand the elasticity of demand for those consumers. Understand how much that consumer is willing to pay. And then finally, the firm has to be able to prevent resale. We have to be able to prevent customers that we charge a low price to from turning around and reselling that product to the customers willing to pay a high price. Now, the idea behind price differentiation is to estimate the shape of the demand curve and then tailor our price accordingly. We see all kinds of real-world examples of this in practice. Airlines raise ticket prices on weekends because they know that people shopping for tickets on weekends are less price sensitive than those shopping during the week. Grocery stores do something similar with fruit and vegetables. Car salesmen talk to you when you first arrive on the car dealership lot and try to figure out how much do you need that new car, and then they charge you a price accordingly. Price differentiation is not the same thing as product differentiation. In product differentiation, we have quality or differences in characteristics of the good or service, and then those might differ by customer. We charge a higher price for a Ferrari than we do for, say, a Chevy, even though functionally they're both cars. Why? Well, because there's different quality characteristics associated with the Ferrari than the Chevy. There's three major types of price differentiation. First-degree price differentiation occurs because you have the ability to charge different prices for each individual based on their unit purchased. For instance, we're able to charge every single individual based on their own willingness to pay. Something like car dealers would be an example of this. We go into a car dealership, the car salesman meets with us and decides how much you or I individually are willing to pay, and then they'll quote us the price accordingly. Second-degree price differentiation occurs when we charge based on the quantity sold or the time of purchase or things like that. Think Sam's Club versus Walmart with bulk discounts, or movie theaters with peak time versus off-peak time pricing. And then third-degree price differentiation occurs when we charge different prices to different groups of consumers based on some feature about them. Think senior citizen discounts or AAA discounts at hotels or movie theaters, for instance. Discounts to the military, things like that. We're charging different groups of consumers based on how much demand we perceive them to have and their sensitivity to price. Now you should understand the main methods of price differentiation, and you can start thinking about how these might be applied to your firm. Once you understand the different pricing models, we can start thinking about how to optimize our price. That is, how to set a price that will maximize the profits of the company. Let me show you what I'm referring to. I'm in the 0202 begin Excel file. Now, I'm looking at the sheet 0202 pricing power. In this particular case, we've got a product which has a range of different prices, anywhere from $10 to $30. And we've collected data about the level of sales across these points. Some of these data points might be prices that we've actually had in the past and the level of units sold. In other cases, we might have estimated this based on one of the forecasting tools we've talked about. Now, in this particular context, what I'd like to do is help us to understand what our optimal price is going to be. So in order to figure that out, we have to ask what's the goal of the firm. Well, for most companies, reasonably, their goal is to maximize profits. So in this case, we have a firm that has fixed costs of $5,000, and their variable cost, or their per unit cost, is $5 per unit. So when the firm is selling product at $10 per, and they have 1,000 in sales, well, their revenues are $10,000. That is, 1,000 sales times $10 per sale is 10 grand. Their costs are $5,000 plus $5 times 1,000 units. So that gives them a profit in this case of $0. 10,000 in revenue minus 10,000 in costs, they've made nothing. Now we raise our price to 11. What happens? Well, the unit sales dip. That's okay though, because our revenue actually rises a little bit, and our costs fall. So now we have a profit of $800. What we want to do now is go through and understand what's our profit maximizing price. Well, we can do this by simply taking these formulas and extrapolating them all the way down. Now, when we do that, where do we see our maximum profit? Well, one way to kind of evaluate this is simply to look at it with a conditional formatting color scale. So I've applied this from the home screen and then the conditional formatting tab. What we see is that around a price of $21, $22, we get kind of our maximum profitability. Let's just look at the price elasticity on this, shall we? So going through and applying that price elasticity all the way down, what we see is that as the price rises, our customer becomes more and more price sensitive. Not a big surprise. But around that $21, $22 price, we have a price elasticity right around -1. This is what we refer to as unit elastic. What that means is that we don't benefit from raising our price anymore. So our target price should be roughly in this level. Based on the prices we've shown here, we want to maximize our profits with a price of $22. Now, of course, we might end up wanting to change this for appearance's sake and make it say $21.99, but that's outside the scope of what we're interested in at this point in time. Either way, at this point, you should be ready to try this on your own. Why don't you go ahead and try putting this method that I've just shown you into practice on your own? Take the simple model we built and then modify it based on a product your firm sells and see how you come out. While textbooks often assume that demand curves are straight lines, in the real world, demand curves are often exactly that, curves. What that really means is the price elasticity of demand, the willingness people have to pay for a particular product, changes, and their sensitivity to price changes as the product price changes. This can have a big impact on the price that we want to set. Let's take a look at what I'm talking about. I'm in the 0203 begin Excel file. Now, we need to be able to adjust our price based on the level of price elasticity we see in the market for our product. This price elasticity can change over the course of the demand curve. So what we see here is a product with fixed costs of $7,000, variable costs of $15 per unit. Now, what I want to do is go through and determine where my profit maximization is. So, of course, as I would expect, I'm not going to make any money if I'm selling for less than $15 per unit. At $15 per unit, I'm still going to lose $7,000 in fixed costs. But once we get beyond $15 per unit, we start to have more profit. So if I carry this all the way down, where do we see maximized profit? Well, again, applying my conditional formatting just to help us to understand this, it looks like we can maximize profit at a price of about $45. Now notice what's happened here. Our price elasticity jumped from -0.98, just under unit elastic, to -1.19. In economics, we typically ignore those negative signs on the price elasticity, and we would say this went from being approximately unit elastic to a little more than elastic. This is the point at which the customer's price sensitivity overwhelms the additional revenue that we can earn from raising price. So we can maximize profit in our example by setting our price here at $45. Now, technically, the other way to make sure that we're maximizing our profit is to set what we refer to as our marginal revenue equal to our marginal cost or our variable cost. Marginal revenue just means how much in the way of additional incremental revenue do we get from selling that next unit. So in this particular case, we look at the change in revenue versus the change in sales. We see that at a price of $45 versus $40, our marginal revenue was $11.37. When we get up to $50, our marginal revenue is $16.28. We're not making quite as much money. Said differently, customer price sensitivity got to be high enough here that it overwhelmed the benefits of increasing our price a little more. So as you're going through and estimating demand curves and trying to forecast what you think sales will be based on your marketing efforts, based on product characteristics, and based, of course, on your customer, take a look at your elasticities and your marginal revenue. Try to set your price so that your price is equal to the point where marginal revenue equals your variable cost or your marginal cost. Or said differently, set your price so that it's right around the point where your price goes from being unit elastic to being elastic. That is where customers are not willing to pay anymore, and you start bleeding more customers than you bring in incremental revenue. Most products will vary somewhat over their demand curve. They'll either be elastic or inelastic in price. In our example here, I've purposely chosen to make that elasticity vary considerably over the demand curve. In the real world, it may not be quite this much. But either way, for any product you're working on, you're now ready to determine a suitable, optimized price. Inherently, all businesses have to choose between price and quantity sold. That's the fundamental truth behind the demand curve. But how do you balance these two factors? Let's take a look at an example of what I call the power of price using Excel. I'm in the 0204 begin Excel file. Now, we're looking at the 0204 price versus volume sheet. And what this shows is for a hypothetical product with unit sales of 1,000, a price of 45, meaning revenue of 45,000, and then unit cost of $16, cost of goods sold of 16,000 then, and overhead of 8,000, we have a profit of 21,000. Now, for the firm, our goal is to maximize profit. As a market researcher, your role is to help the firm to understand how they can go about maximizing that profit by making changes to the product, its features, its price, its attributes, etc. So, what if you were presented with an opportunity to either have a 1% improvement in price, a 1% improvement in volume, a 1% improvement in variable cost, or a 1% improvement in fixed cost? Everything else equal. What should you choose? Well, let's see. So a 1% increase in price would mean we went from $45 to a price of $45.45. And we were able to capture that incremental 1% change in price without any negative impact to unit sales, or to our costs, or to our overhead. A 1% change in volume means that we get an increase in unit sales of 10. We go from 1,000 units to 1,010 without any negative impact on price, cost, or overhead. This is the equivalent of saying our end market grew, right? We can envision as an example the end market growing, say because of population growth or something similar. We can either experience that end market growth in the form of greater sales volume at our same price, or we keep that static end market the same That is, we give up that little bit of growth in population in exchange for a little bit higher price. Now, our other two alternatives might be to have a benefit from unit costs or a benefit from overhead. And this would reduce our unit cost from $16 to $15.84 per unit, or our overhead from $8,000 to $79.20. Well, what we're really interested in here is profit, the bottom line. So let's go through and fill out the rest of the chart and see which improvement is the best. So what happens? Well, the 1% change in price and the 1% change in volume both boost revenue by the same $450. The improvement in variable cost and fixed costs have no benefit on revenue. Now what happens with COGS? Well, COGS is unaffected by the 1% change in price. We're still selling the same 1,000 units. It rises with our change in volume. With variable costs, with that benefit, it falls a little bit. With fixed cost benefit, it stays the same. So what's the bottom line? Our biggest boost to profit comes from the 1% change in price. Why? It's because that 1% incremental volume in price flows directly through to the bottom line. Anytime we can capture price without giving up share, that'll directly boost our bottom line more than either a boost in volume, a boost in cost savings, or a boost in overhead savings. All else equal, the best single choice we can make is to capture that additional price. This is true for any product out there, as long as we don't necessarily care about our market share. You know, the exception to this would be if we're talking about a software product where there's a lot of network externalities. Think something like Microsoft Windows or Facebook, where we benefit from having other people using that platform. For most products out there, that's not the case. So if we can capture 1% in just one of these four areas, we should make it in price. Now, at this stage, you're ready to think about the price-volume trade-off for your firm. How could you maximize profits based on pricing power that your firm might already have? Think about it. Weigh the opportunities with price versus volume and consider whether you have an opportunity on that front. Market research is inherently a quantitative exercise in exploring a market. That means we need to be able to effectively model profits and unit sales for a product based on a variety of different factors or choices. One instance might be a change in the business model. For instance, we could talk about simply selling a product in a standard retail fashion, where we charge a price and people pay for it on a unit sales basis. An alternative to this might be a wholesale type model or a club pricing type model, similar to that followed by something like Sam's Club or Walmart or many of the other wholesale firms that are out there. Let's take a look at how we might model that in Excel. I'm in the 0205 begin Excel file. Now, what we have here is a wholesale pricing example where we've got the equivalent of a price club. We've got a particular product that's being sold. We've got a number of customers, and each of these customers pay a club membership cost of $100. Now, based on the number of customers, we also have some sort of number of sales. The number of units sold is going to be a function both of the number of customers and of the number of units that each customer chooses to buy. Our revenue, then, is related to both of these factors. So our revenue is based on the number of sales times the price per unit plus the club membership cost times the number of customers. Now, we think about our cost being a function of our variable cost per unit plus our fixed costs. And this, in turn, gives us our profits for the firm. Now, what happens in this particular case? Well, when we look at this example, again, we're going to try to maximize our profitability. If we didn't take into account the club membership cost, if there were no membership cost for joining the club, watch what happens. Well, now we're going to maximize our profits by charging right around $22 per unit. We sell 346 units. We have a profit of $875.17. In contrast, if we charge, say, $100 for the membership cost, now we want to keep our prices really low so that we get lots of club memberships sold, plus we sell some units of the product. Notice, we're actually selling below cost in this case, but we get so many memberships that it more than makes up for it. This is a function of the elasticity of that membership price. Now, we could look at different membership prices and try to maximize what that profitability might be based on those membership prices. What we would need to do, though, is model how the number of customers changes based on the membership cost in question, which we haven't done here. So we want to keep in mind that whatever membership price we charge, the number of customers that we get is going to be based on that. The point being that in this type of a scenario, it's a little more complicated than just marginal cost equals marginal revenue, or trying to find the point where we switch over from an elastic to an inelastic product, or vice versa. Instead, we have to take into account not only the price that we're going to charge on the underlying product, but also the price that we're charging for that membership. So it's actually a dual problem that we're facing. Excel is great for modeling this type of complexity. Go through, put in estimates for what we think our customer base will be based on different membership cost levels, and then we can come up with the optimal price that we can charge based on that. Try putting together this type of model on your own. Change some of the variables I've included here and see how you make out. Attribution is the term for understanding how much credit advertising should get for driving a sale. In other words, how do we separate out customers that would have bought anyway from customers who are induced to buy due to our advertising? Excel can help with this. I'm in the 0206 begin Excel file. Now, what we've got here is a set of hypothetical financials for a company called Red 30. And in particular, we've got revenue and net income for the full fiscal year 2017. Against that, we've also got our standard marketing expenses broken down based on different categories. And of course, if you're a marketing professional, many of these will look familiar to you. We've got our online advertising, our television and radio ads, our print ads, sponsored content, and then a variety of others. And we can even drill down and look at more isolated examples like social media spend in particular areas, etc. Now, for our purposes, I want to do some attribution analysis on our advertising spend. So to do that, I'm going to turn to our 0206 attribution sheet. And what I've done here is taken all of the revenues and all of the net incomes for Red 30 during this period, and then I've matched them up with our advertising spending in our 5 major areas: online, television and radio, print, sponsored content, and others. Now, we see that we're spending money in all of these areas. So we might ask ourselves, okay, well, what areas are the most valuable? What areas are really helping us to drive net income or sales versus other areas? Where should we be focusing our marketing spend? We've got limited resources. How do we optimize that? Well, one great tool to examine this issue is the regression. So I'm going to come over to the data tab and come over to the data analysis option. Now, if you don't have this option in your Excel, then you'll need to go to File, Options, Add-ins, and add that. So once I've got data analysis, I'm going to scroll down here to regression and click OK. And in this case, I want to put in my Y input range. And I'm going to start with net income. I want to understand, in particular, how much of my advertising spend is leading to incremental profit. We could perform the same exercise based on sales, but I'm going to start focused on profitability. Against that, I'm going to be regressing my different advertising categories: online, television, print, sponsored, and other. And I'm going to include my labels here. We could check and say constant is 0 if we felt that if we didn't advertise at all, we'd end up with 0 sales. I'm going to assume that that's not the case. And to make this easier to kind of examine, I'm going to put this in our same sheet here. So I'll put this in starting at A16. Now, I'm going to click OK, and let's see what happens. What this shows us is that we have a very strong regression here. The R squared is very, very high on this particular regression. I'm going to take out this section. We're not as interested in that. And I'm going to clean up our data, make it just a little bit easier to read by highlighting it and then holding down the control, the number 1, and then coming down and changing this to be numbers with 2 decimal places, etc. And these particular cells are duplicative, so I'm going to go ahead and delete these, just shifting those over to the left. Now, what does this show us? Well, when we look at the data, what we're most interested in down here is the coefficient. That coefficient tells us, in essence, how much incremental profit do we earn through additional spending in any particular category. The higher this number, the more useful that particular form of advertising is. So what this is going to show us is that we get our highest return on investment from print, followed by television, and then online advertising. Sponsored content and other do not appear to be very effective as advertising tools. Now, we can certainly go through and refine this regression a little bit. But what this is showing us more than anything else, at least for the limited set of data that we've got here, looks like our print advertising is the most lucrative form of advertising from a profitability standpoint. I could go through and rerun this based on sales as well if I want to understand not just which customers are profitable and which incremental advertising is driving profitability, but which specifically driving sales. Again, though, the key is the more data we have here, the better off we'll be. We only had 12 data points. We'd be far better off if we could look at this on, say, a weekly or a daily basis if we had our advertising broken down to that level of granularity. Regardless, this is just hypothetical data. At this point, though, you should understand what attribution in advertising is and how to start measuring it and evaluating it using data in Excel. Market segmentation is one of the most important tasks when doing marketing research. Let's talk about what this means. So, when we're doing marketing research, we want to understand who our customers are and ideally why they're buying from us. So we start by segmenting markets. To segment markets, we divide our total market into smaller, distinct groups of customers that have similar characteristics based on things like demographics, say ages, genders, incomes, or psychographics based on things like lifestyles and values, or geographic location, or even buying behaviors. And the idea here is that we want to allow us to tailor individual marketing strategies to specific segments of our customer base. So what are the key steps here in market segmentation? First, we need to go through and identify our overall market. That is, we want to define the market that we are targeting. Next, we need to choose our segmentation variables. We've got to select which factors we think are relevant for dividing up that market and which represent our customers broadly within individual groups. Next, we're going to go through and analyze customer data. So we're going to gather information about our existing customers and then potential customers, ideally, through surveys, maybe focus groups, market research reports, anything along those lines. From there, we can go through and do various forms of cluster analysis. And this basically is just statistical tests to help us to understand what are the key characteristics of these customers and what are the key drivers in those customers' behavior. From there, we can develop segment profiles. That is, we want to go through and create a detailed description of each segment, each theoretical target customer, based on their needs, their wants, and their buying behavior. And then finally, we want to go through and assess whether our segments are accurate or viable. That is, what's the size of each of these segments, what's the growth potential, and what's the profitability of each segment. Do we want to be focused on certain segments over other segments, for example? Are there some segments that are growing fast? Are there segments that aren't profitable and we should be exiting those submarkets? That type of analysis. So how do we go through and segment our market? Well, there's a variety of different approaches that we can use, but four of the most popular are demographic segmentation, geographic segmentation, psychographic segmentation, and behavioral segmentation. Demographic segmentation is just based on observable demographic characteristics, things like age, gender, income, family size, education level, that type of thing. It's fairly straightforward to do and reasonably straightforward to get that data. Geographic segmentation is, if anything, a little bit easier. We're separating customers based on location. This we will usually have if they have purchased from us before, right? We'll have data on the store they bought from or where we ship to or things like that. Psychographic segmentation can be very valuable, but it's often harder to get data because what we're trying to do is group customers based on things like lifestyle or their personality traits, their values, things like that. Well, we may or may not have any data on this. Potentially, we might have some data, maybe if we can get some web reports on like their browsing behavior or where they were prior to coming to our website, something like that. But that type of data, while very valuable, is arguably the hardest to get. And then finally, we have behavioral segmentation. Here we're categorizing customers based on their buying habits with us, their usage of our service, data that we can observe directly and influences how they interact with our business. Now, when we're going through and building our market segments, there's different considerations we want to take into account. First is measurability. We want to ensure that we can easily gather data on the characteristics of each segment. So I alluded to psychographic segmentation earlier. Maybe we think that understanding our customers' values and lifestyle would be very valuable. But if we can't get the data on it, it doesn't really matter. It's a moot point. It's an academic point, right? We've got to be able to measure something about the customers in order to segment them effectively. Next, we've got to make sure from an accessibility standpoint that we can reach and communicate with each segment. Do we have some ability to tailor our marketing message to a particular subset of our customers? Equally importantly, can we ensure that the marketing message we send to one group of customers doesn't bleed through to other groups of customers and upset them or dilute their image of our brand? For example, if we're thinking about trying to offer coupons to one set of our customers, we want to make sure that other customers won't find out about that and be upset that they weren't also offered a coupon. Next, we need to think about substantiality. We need to make sure that each segment we're targeting is large enough to be profitable. Is there a reason to be targeting a particular group with a specialized marketing message? And then finally, differentiability. We need to make sure that segments have distinct needs and preferences that lead to tailored marketing messages. If the segments aren't really differentiated, there's really no reason to have individual marketing messages for those individual segments. We should instead group them together and be more efficient. But in a nutshell, that's what you need to know about market segmentation. Now, let's think about how this looks in practice and how we can start to apply that. That's coming up in the next video.